Part 1. Chapter 1. Montana. Its story and biography, as the lives of the states go, Montana has had a short record, but like intense personalities, Montana and her people have condensed much achievement into a brief span of activities. The land of the shining mountains and of magnificent distances commenced to be sprinkled with a few adventuresome gold seekers during the early years of the Civil War, albeit her diverse and wonderful territory, lying along the great range of northern travel between the Mississippi Valley and the Pacific coast, had been traversed by such government agents as Lewis and Clark, and by faithful enthusiasts of the Catholic Church. The Jesuit fathers and the pioneer trappers and fur traders had even planted the seeds of industry in the valleys of the Missouri and Yellowstone before the California of a previous generation was reproduced with all its excitement and riot within the confines of what is now the state of Montana. The old fur traders and guides of the older days led the seeker of gold to Bannack and Virginia cities, to Helena and the Hell Gate regions of western Montana. Mining camps and towns, with their crude business houses, sprung into life, with small cattle ranches and farms, but the basis of the first period of progress was laid in the gold mines. Agriculture and the raising of livestock were side issues. Then came the time of the great ranges for cattle, horses, and sheep, with the mining of gold, silver, and copper as still the powerful agents of advancement. At first, such interests were removed from adequate transportation, and the protecting forces of civil law and order were only weakly organized. Uncle Sam attempted to tide over this critical period with his military arm, then still weakened by the stress of the Civil War. He did what he could, but until the railroads got into their stride, the potential riches of Montana were yet conjectural. To be fair to the great Commonwealth, the truth is that it is only within 40 years that she has been given a fair chance with her sisters of the West. At that, nature, in the forms of drought and bad lands, has been most unkind, so that, although the territory of Montana is within a few thousand square miles of that of California, the home areas which are naturally productive are comparatively restricted. But the state and the nation are working together so strongly and persistently that both arid and swamplands are everywhere being reclaimed. The virile spirit of Montana, coupled with the engineering and scientific solutions of irrigation, draining, and farming, which are being continuously put into practice, are bound to give the state a high and permanent standing. The schools, the newspapers, the commercial organizations, the libraries, and the churches are all cooperating in the work of both advancing and uplifting those interests, which, as a whole, make the state what it is. The history of Montana, which is here presented, has endeavored to etch this record of struggles and real achievements in such a way that its strong lines shall be preserved and the story not be weighted and obscured with details. With this end in view, countless authorities, private and public, officials of the state and national governments, actors in the events treated, historians and scientists, have all been consulted, and ofttimes their very words have been reproduced. In fact, such treatment of the context has been in line with the well-considered policy of the editor and his associates. The story of Montana has been told, as nearly as possible, through the contributions of those best qualified to speak and write. In this connection, the supervising editor cannot but express his profound regret that two of his most valuable associates should have been cut off by death from rendering to him the full extent of their suggestions, advice, and cooperation. The venerable, able, and historic characters, General Charles S. Warren, late of Butte, and ex-United States Senator Paris Gibson, the founder of Great Falls, fought a good fight for Montana, although they could not live to see this record in print, which now goes forth with the usual feeling of misgivings as to the perfection of anything human. These misgivings are natural, despite the fact that no effort has been neglected to make the history correct and complete in the essentials. To the many who have cooperated in this task, hearty thanks are offered, and they are so numerous that the mention of names would be superfluous, and it might be, by unintentional omissions, unfair. History of Montana. Chapter 1 approaches to the land of the Shining Mountains. In the days of ancient classic lore, when Rome was sending her legions into the Rocky Mountains of Western Europe, the Latin authors spoke of the strange and unexplored land as Montana, the land of the mountains. Thus the name became attached to the American land of the mountains, although her lovers of several generations have chosen to think of her in the translated poetry of the Indian christening bestowed upon the Rocky Mountains, the land of the Shining Mountains. Vague rumors reached the whites of the New World that such poetic and grand christening was based upon the prosaic but enticing fact of reflected light from precious minerals and stones. The magnet was one with that which drew the Spaniards into the interior of southern United States. Besides the lust for precious substance, the French especially were possessed with a religious ardor for the conversion of the natives and an unquenchable spirit of adventure in the discovery and exploration of unknown rivers and lands. America discovered as a continent, the second great quest for the adventurers, geographers, and royalists of France was to trace the grand waterways at which the Indians had persistently hinted, winding their splendid courses from the Mississippi Valley to the coast of the Pacific. La Hontaine's Long River. In 1690 to 1703, La Hontaine, a French baron adventurer and somewhat romancer, explored the country around the headwaters of the Mississippi and wrote a purported account of his travels and adventures. In the maps which he published, Long River appeared as a distinguishing feature. It was outside of his immediate field of investigation and probably drawn from rather vague information which he had obtained from the Sioux of the upper Mississippi Valley. From the fact that he was a proven prevaricator in many respects, most historians put down Long River as a figment of his imagination. Others more charitable, like the late Joaquin Miller, who wrote a history of Montana in 1894, give him this credit: this is unjust to La Hontaine, for there is good reason to believe that the information concerning Long River, which he obtained from the Indians, referred to the Missouri, but in passing through the many intervening tribes, it became greatly exaggerated. For instance, the many lakes on Long River do exist in the vicinity of the headwaters of the Missouri, such as Flathead Lake, Henry's Lake, Jackson Lake, Yellowstone Lake, Lake Pocokee, Great Salt Lake, etc., but by the time the knowledge of them reached the Indians with whom he came in contact, it is very natural they should locate them all on and along the upper Missouri, and it may also be that La Hontaine could but very imperfectly understand them, and therefore may have made these mistakes himself. Lewis and Clark Expedition in Montana. Enter the Catholic priests. Among those who severely criticized La Hontaine was Father Bobe, a learned priest of Versailles, who nevertheless held that the Mississippi swerved toward the west and south and was constantly urging the French government to search for a northern interior route to the Pacific. On the March 15, 1716, he wrote to Delisle, geographer of the Academy of Science, at Paris: "They tell me that among the Sioux of the Mississippi there are always Frenchmen trading, that the course of the Mississippi is from north to west and from west to south, that it is known that toward the source there is in the highlands a river that leads to the western ocean. For the last 2 years I tormented exceedingly the governor, General M. Raudot, and M. Douche to endeavor to discover this ocean. If I succeed, as I hope, we shall have tidings before 3 years, and I shall have the pleasure and the consolation of having rendered a good service to geography, to religion, and to the state. Duke of Orleans commences western explorations." At this period, France was being ruled by the Duke of Orleans as regent, who decided to launch the great adventure in a practical way by establishing 3 bases of supply for the western explorations. The first of these was at the head of Lake Superior near the mouth of the Kaministigia River, where Sieur Greysolon du Luth had founded a post as early as 1678. A second was ordered to be built at Lac des Christenots, the Lake of the Woods, and a third at Lake Winnipeg. The work of construction was under the supervision of Lieutenant Bertel de la Noue. These posts were not to be a charge on the French government. Parkman says in his Half-Century of Conflict that by a device common in such cases, those who built and maintained them were to be paid by a monopoly of the fur trade in the adjacent countries. Once the posts were established, however, it would be incumbent upon the government to equip, pay, and direct the future explorations. And Historical Magazine, New York, 1859. History of Montana. Charlevoix investigates. During the first year, little more was accomplished than the building of a stockade at the mouth of the Kaministigia. Then passed 3 years when the Duke of Orleans sent Charlevoix, the learned Jesuit, to Canada to investigate these rumors of a great western waterway to a great western sea. And in this work he spent a year among the Indians and whites of the upper lake region, making full records of his travels and conclusions for the benefit of the French archives and posterity. Pierre Margry, keeper of the French archives in Paris, says of Charlevoix's plans formed as a result of his visit to the country of the upper Mississippi, the regent, in choosing between the 2 plans that Father Charlevoix presented to him at the close of his journey for the attainment of a knowledge of the Western Sea, through an unfortunate prudence, rejected the suggestion which, it is true, was the most expensive and uncertain, viz., an expedition up the Missouri to its source and beyond, and decided to establish a post among the Sioux. The post of the Sioux was consequently established in 1727. Father Goner, a Jesuit missionary who had gone upon the expedition, we are told, was, however, obliged to return without being able to discover anything that would satisfy the expectations of the court about the Western Sea. The decade of attempts to establish the post at Lake Pepin, named Fort Beauharnois after the governor of Canada, and the mission, St. Michael, was surcharged with disaster of flood and Indian assault, and in 1737 its commander, Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, abandoned all attempts to get in touch with the Sioux and advised his superiors that they should be exterminated, the Vérendryes, father and sons. In the meantime, Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, known afterward as Sieur de la Vérendrye, a native of a worthy French-Canadian family of Three Rivers, who had served as a brave soldier of fortune in the War of the Spanish Succession, returned to Canada and become a coureur de bois, had his mind full of these tales of western rivers and a western sea. Furthermore, the Indian stories were being repeatedly enforced by testimony presented by the priests with whom he came in contact. In his middle age, Vérendrye was so well established as a fur trader that in 1728 he was in command of the post at Lake Nepegon, Canada, whose waters flow into Lake Superior from the north. The most complete account of his endeavors to explore the great western interior in search of a transcontinental waterway for which historic event he laid the foundation and two of his sons enjoyed the realization, was prepared 45 years ago by Reverend E.D. Neal, historian and president of Macalester College, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and to his paper were added valuable notes by Granville Stewart, the gold pioneer and long a leader in the upbuilding of the Historical Society of Montana. While stationed at Lake Nepegon, Vérendrye received from the Indians such positive assurances as to a river which flowed toward the Sea of the West that he resolved to make an exploration. At Mackinac, while on his way to confer with the government of Canada upon the subject, Father de Gonor arrived from the post which had been established among the Sioux, nearly opposite Maiden Rock, Wisconsin, on the shores of Lake Pepin. The latter is an expansion of the Mississippi River about midway between Minnesota and Wisconsin. After an interchange of views, says Dr. Neal's narrative, the priest promised to assist him as far as he could in obtaining a permit and outfit for the establishment of a post among the Knisteneux, or the Assiniboines, from which to go farther west. Charles de Beauharnois, then governor of Canada, gave him a respectful hearing and carefully examined the map of the region west of the Great Lakes, which had been drawn by Achaga, the Indian guide of Vérendrye. Orders were soon given to fit out an expedition of 50 men. It left Montreal in 173, under the conduct of his sons and nephew, he not joining the party until 1733, in consequence of the detention of business. After establishing several posts and forts between Rainy Lake and Lake Winnipeg, their advance was stopped in the Winnipeg region by the exhaustion of supplies. In April 1735, arrangements were made for a second equipment, and a fourth son joined the expedition. In June 1736, while 21 of the expedition were camped upon an isle in the Lake of the Woods, they were surprised by a band of Sioux hostile to the French allies, the Knisteneux, and all killed. The island, upon this account, is called in the early maps Massacre Island. A few days after, a party of 5 Canadian voyagers discovered their dead bodies and scalped heads. Father Huneau, the missionary, was found upon one knee, an arrow in his head, his breast bare, his left hand touching the ground, and the right hand raised. Among the slaughtered was also a son of Vérendrye, who had a tomahawk in his back, and his body was adorned with garters and bracelets of porcupine. The father was at the fort at the Lake of the Woods when he received the news of his son's murder, and about the same time heard of the death of his enterprising nephew on the October 3rd, 1738. They built an advance post, Fort Lorraine, on the river Assiniboine, which they called St. Charles, and beyond was a branch called St. Pierre. These two rivers received the baptismal name of Vérendrye, which was Pierre, and Governor Beauharnois, governor of Canada, which was Charles. This post, Fort Lorraine, became the center of trade and point of departure for explorations either north or south at this newly established post. La Vérendrye received news from the Assiniboines, a friendly offshot of the Sioux, of the existence of the strange Mantanes Mandans, or Whitebeards, of the Dakota family, whose villages were along the Missouri. They received that name from the fact that they became gray-haired so young. The Assiniboines also assured the leader of the expedition, which was more to his mind, that the Mandans knew the way to the Western Sea and would furnish him guides thither. On the October 18th, 1738, La Vérendrye, with 3 of his sons and a mixed company of Indians and French Canadians, to the number of 52, started for the land of the Mandans. The succeeding 10 days took them, as is believed, to Turtle Mountain, thence along the Assiniboine and the Mouse Rivers toward their destination, gathering friendly and helpful Indian guides on the way. On the 28th of October, the first Mandans were seen, and La Vérendrye's journal contains their first description by white men. At the time of his visit during the first days of December, they occupied 6 villages on the banks of the Missouri in what is now the northwestern part of North Dakota. And La Vérendrye called the Missouri the great river of the Couhachat Nation. While thus engaged in friendly intercourse, the leader was robbed of all the presents which he had brought with, which to propitiate the Indians along the route of his western journey, and was therefore obliged to retrace his way to Fort La Reine to replace his stock of gifts, which was, perhaps, the most necessary part of his outfit. Leaving 2 of his men among the Mandans to learn their language and collect information which might be of benefit to him, La Vérendrye retraced his way to Fort La Reine. It was a terrible journey in the dead of a bitter northern winter and was not completed until near the middle of February. It was not until September 1739 that the 2 men who had been living with the Mandans returned to Fort La Reine to report to their leader. They brought tidings of strange western tribes who had visited the Mandans in the conduct of trade and told of a great salt lake and the great salt water. La Vérendrye therefore dispatched to the Mandan villages as large a company as he could gather under his oldest son Pierre, with instructions to secure guides and push on to the Western Ocean. But when La Vérendrye, the younger, reached his destination, the Indians of the farther west who professed to know of the existence of that Western Ocean had departed from the Mandan villages and left no trace behind them. In the summer of 1740, he, therefore, did no more than to bring to Fort La Reine another bitter disappointment to the elder man, already nearly crushed with bodily and mental struggles. In the year named, La Vérendrye went to Montreal for the 3rd time to solicit aid in support of his futile attempts to open up a western way. Instead of proffered assistance, he found hungry creditors awaiting him. In his journal, published in Margry's Collections, he further describes the pitiful state of his affairs. In spite of the derangement of my affairs, the envy and jealousy of various persons impelled them to write letters to the court insinuating that I thought of nothing but making my fortune. If more than 40,000 livres of debt, which I have on my shoulders, are an advantage, then I can flatter myself that I am very rich. In all my misfortunes, I have the consolation of seeing that M. de Beauharnois enters into my views, recognizes the uprightness of my intentions, and does me justice in spite of opposition. Francis Parkman, in his Half-Century of Conflict, Vol. 2, p. 34, says Beauharnois twice appealed to the court to give La Vérendrye some little aid, urging that he was at the end of his resources and that a grant of 30,000 francs or $6,000 would enable him to find a way to the Pacific. All help was refused, but La Vérendrye was told that he might let out his forts to other traders and so raise means to pursue the discovery. The Vérendrye brothers start westward. Now broken in health and subdued in spirit, the father turned over his dear enterprise to his more vigorous sons, Pierre de la Vérendrye and the Chevalier, who, with 2 fellow Frenchmen, again headed for the Mandans on the Missouri in the spring of 1742. They left the Lake of the Woods on the 29th of April and reached the Missouri after about 3 weeks of travel. After impatiently waiting for the coming of some Western Indians called Horse Indians by the Mandans, and passing the spring and summer in tiresome inaction, the young Frenchmen induced 2 of their red friends to guide them to the camping grounds of the horse tribe. These were found to be deserted. Parkman believes the site of this camp to be west of the Little Missouri and perhaps a part of the Powder River Range. The locality would seem, at least, to have been in southeastern Montana. The time was in August 1742, and it was not until nearly a month later, after one of the Mandan guides had deserted the party, that the 4 Frenchmen met a band of Indians whom they called les beaux hommes, or handsome men, believed to be the Crows. They were enemies of the Mandans, and the remaining guide of that tribe hastily deserted. The expedition remained some 3 weeks with the handsome men, and on October 9th continued its explorations in a southwesterly direction, still looking for the Horse Indians. When the 4 reached the village of these evident nomads, they were told that the tribe bows, still to the southwest, would enlighten them as to the Western Ocean. As was customary, each tribe referred the whites to a more distant tribe. This seemed to have been the settled policy of the red man, to lure the white farther and farther from his own, and by the attrition of hard travel and slaughter attempt to wear away his strength and life. Indian picture of I-742. When in October 1742, the Frenchmen at last reached the lodges of the long-sought horse Indians, as stated by Parkman, who adapts his narrative from the Chevalier's journal, they found them in the extremity of distress and terror. Their camp resounded with howls and wailings, and not without cause, for the Snakes or Shoshones, a formidable people living farther westward, had lately destroyed most of their tribe. The Snakes were the terror of that country. The brothers were told that the year before they had destroyed 17 villages, killing warriors and old women, and carrying off the young women and children as slaves. Parkman, who, as he observes in a footnote, draws the particulars of his description from repeated observations of similar scenes, draws a graphic picture, half-century of conflict, Vol 2, p. 48, of this breaking up of the camp. The squaws, he says, took down the lodges, and the march began over prairies dreary and brown, with the withering touch of autumn. The spectacle was such as men still young have seen in these western lands, but which no man will see again. The vast plains swarmed with the moving multitude. The tribes of the Missouri and Yellowstone had by this time abundance of horses, the best of which were used for war and hunting, and the others as beasts of burden. These last were equipped in a peculiar manner. Several of the long poles used to frame the teepees or lodges were secured by one end to each side of a rude saddle, while the other end trailed on the ground. Crossbars lashed to the poles just behind the horse kept them 3 or 4 feet apart and formed a firm support on which was laid compactly folded the buffalo skin covering of the lodge. On this again sat a mother with her young family, sometimes stowed for safety in a large open willow basket, with the occasional addition of some domestic pet, such as a tame raven, a puppy, or even a small bear cub. Other horses were laden in the same manner with wooden bowls, stone hammers, and other utensils, along with stores of dried buffalo meat packed in cases of rawhide whitened and painted. Many of the innumerable dogs, whose manners and appearance strongly suggested their relatives the wolves, to whom, however, they bore a mortal grudge, were equipped in a similar manner, with shorter poles and lighter loads. Bands of naked boys, noisy and restless, roamed the prairie, practicing their bows and arrows on any small animal they might find. Gay young squaws, adorned on each cheek with a spot of ochre or red clay, and arrayed in tunic of fringed buckskin embroidered with porcupine quills, were mounted on ponies, astride like men, while lean and tattered hags, the drudges of the tribe, unkempt and hideous, scolded the lagging horses, or screeched at the disorderly dogs, with voices not unlike the yell of the great horned owl. Most of the warriors were on horseback, armed with round white shields of bullhide, feathered lances, war clubs, bows and quivers filled with stone-headed arrows, while a few of the elders, wrapped in robes of buffalo hide, stalked along in groups with a stately air, chatting, laughing, and exchanging unseemly jokes. Reached the friendly Bow Indians. Finally, the Verendrys reached the land of the Bow Indians, Jeanne de l'Arc, and found them preparing to take the warpath against the powerful Snake Indians, who had already nearly exterminated the horses. The Bow Indians, through their chief, were very courteous. They knew nothing personally of the Western Sea, although they had heard of the Great Water from certain Snake prisoners. Parkman quotes from the Chevalier's journal as follows: "Thus far we had been well received in all the villages we had passed, but this was nothing compared with the courteous manners of the great chief of the Bow Indians, who, unlike the others, was not self-interested in the least, and who took excellent care of everything belonging to us, trip of vengeance and discovery." Further, according to Parkman's half-century of conflict, the courteous and honorable chief of the Bows extended this invitation, so vital to the definite course of this narrative and which meant so much to the fame of the sons of La Vérendrye: "Come with us. We are going towards the mountains, where you can see the great water that you are looking for." The great water was not to be seen, but the vast shining piles of the Rocky Mountains were to be first spread before the eyes of white travelers and recorders. The camp of the Bows was broke up, its warriors poured across the prairie, eager to attack their Snake enemies, the Frenchmen riding along with the Red warriors. Pierre and his younger brother, the Chevalier, were near the great chief, when, on the 1st of January, 1743, they came in sight of the vast mountain range, capped and shining with snow. A council of the chiefs and warriors was held to determine what course to pursue. The decision of the council was that the women and children and infirm be left behind in a place of comparative safety, while the warriors sallied forth in a body to strike the hated Snakes. The Chevalier discovers the Rockies. Pierre and the Chevalier were invited to accompany the advancing army. After deliberation, the elder Pierre determined to remain with the camp to watch over and protect the belongings of the party, and the young chevalier chose to proceed with the warriors, though he prudently declined to engage in any possible combat with the foe. The chevalier discovers the Rockies. Pierre and the chevalier were invited to accompany the advancing army. After deliberation, the elder Pierre determined to remain with the camp to watch over and protect the belongings of the party, and the young chevalier chose to proceed with the warriors, though he prudently declined to engage in any possible combat with the foe. The war party started on its advance January 21st, 1743, and, according to the chevalier, who kept a journal of the expedition, reached the base of the mountains, probably the Big Horn Range, 12 days later. The young French leader was anxious to ascend some peak of the range and look for the Western Sea. But although the bows conveyed the idea that everything must give place to vengeance upon the Snakes, when some of their scouts returned to the main body of the warriors with the information that they had discovered a camp of the enemy, hastily abandoned, the bows were panic-stricken over the possibility that the Snakes had circumvented them and wiped out their own camp of women, children, and infirm. The Indian war party was completely demoralized, and even the chief abandoned the chevalier temporarily to endeavor to rally his men and keep them intact. Finally, they had all gathered at the camp, only to find it unmolested. The chief and a few of his faithful warriors were the last to return, as they had been searching the desolate and storm-driven plain for their guest, the chevalier, whom they feared had perished. At length, the Indian chief appeared in camp, exhausted and grief-stricken, but, the chevalier writes, his sorrow turned to joy, and he could not give us attention and caresses enough. The homeward journey. The Frenchman remained with the chief of the bows during January and February 1743, traveling with the Indians through deep snowdrifts in a southeasterly direction. About the 1st of March, they approached the winter grounds of the Little Cherry, or Choke Cherry Indians in what is now western South Dakota. The Verendrye brothers at once sent one of their men ahead to gain from that tribe any information which might be of benefit to them in their discouraging search for the Western Sea by an overland route. The Chokecherries were kind to the courier, and through him invited the white men to visit them, but conveyed no information along the line of their investigations. On the 15th of March, having bidden farewell to the friendly chief of the bows and his immediate followers, the Verendryes, according to their journal, arrived among the band of the Little Cherry, who, where we found them, were 2 days' march from their camp on the Missouri. It is believed that this locality was about where Cherry Creek empties into the Cheyenne, some 50 miles from the Missouri and about 80 miles west of the present capital of South Dakota, Pierre. Still traveling east and not far from the banks of the Missouri River, the Frenchmen erected a pile of stone, taking the precaution not to reveal to the Indians the significance of the leaden plate which accompanied it. According to the Chevalier's journal, on an eminence near the fort camp, I placed a leaden plate engraved with the arms and inscription of the king, and some stones in shape of a pyramid in honor of the General Beauharnois, death of Sieur de la Vérendrye. On the 2nd of April, Pierre and the Chevalier commenced their travels toward the northwest, which brought them to the Mandan villages on the 18th of May. The return of the sons to the Sieur de la Vérendrye not only lightened the anxiety and depression of the father, but appears to have improved his fortunes. The latter was made captain of the Order of St. Louis, and the 2 sons were promoted in the royal service. In 1749, the new governor, Monsieur the Marquis de la Jonquière, a hard man and master, had, nevertheless, commissioned the Sieur to look after the posts and explorations in the West, and he had already prepared maps and memoranda of his future explorations, when death called him from his unrealized ambitions, on December 6th of the year named. About a year after the death of his father, Chevalier de la Vérendrye wrote to La Jonquière appealing for service in the field of Western explorations on the score of the sacrifices made by his father and brothers. Instead, the governor appointed one M. de Saint-Pierre to head one of the expeditions, and by various misrepresentations to La Jonquière, the La Vérendryes were made decidedly persona non gratis and rejected from all participation in it. Last years of the Chevalier. The condition of the family whose various members had blazed the way to the Rocky Mountains is thus described in the Chevalier's petition to the governor. My returns this year amount to half, and in consequence of 1,000 harassments my ruin is accomplished. For accounts contracted by father and myself, I find I am indebted for more than 20,000 francs. I remain without money or patrimony. I am simply ensign of 2nd grade. My elder brother has only the same rank as myself, and my younger brother is only cadet, and this is the actual result of all that my father, my brothers, and I have done. That brother of mine who was murdered some years since by the Indians, victim that he was by the Western Sea, was not the most unfortunate one. His blood is to us nothing worth. The sweat of our father and ourselves has availed us not. We are compelled to yield that which has cost us so much, if M. de Saint Pierre does not entertain a better feeling, and communicate same to Mnumux de la Jonquière. Both expeditions sent out by La Jonquière were failures. In 1753, about the time that the Saint Pierre fiasco was reporting to the authorities, the Chevalier was made ensign of the first grade and 4 years later became a lieutenant. In November 1761, after Quebec had fallen to the English, the Chevalier with other fellow officers sailed for France in the Auguste. 100 persons were on board. Not far from the North Cape of Isle Royale, on the coast of Cape Breton, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, the ship was wrecked and all perished, including the Chevalier, except the captain, a colonial officer, and 5 soldiers. Thus died the actual white discoverer of the Rocky Mountains, although it is still a matter of conjecture as to how far west he penetrated, or the specific location of the leaden plate and the rough stone monument erected somewhere in the region of the Cheyenne and Missouri rivers to commemorate the exploration and international claim of France to some little portion of what afterward was known as Louisiana. The approach from the Pacific. Verendrye and his sons had been approaching the land of the Shining Mountains through the interior of the East, and the next progress in tracing the transcontinental waterway was to be from the Pacific Columbia River route of the West. The Spaniards and Portuguese pushed up the Pacific coast in early historic times and left such names on the maps as Cape Blanco, Straits of Fuca, and Oregon, but in their rush for gold and booty found little time to record their voyages in the interest of cartography. Then came the more reliable northern navigators, Bering, the Dane, and Drake, the Englishman, to approach the latitude of Montana on the Pacific coast. But it was left for Captain James Cook, so far as we can say positively, to point his ship's prow toward the mountains of Montana and break the hush of icebound seas as nearly under the beetling banks of Montana as ocean ships have ever sailed or ever shall sail. In 1778, while the Revolution was raging along the fringes of the Atlantic coast, Captain Cook was exploring the Bering region and sailing up the Oregon Columbia River as far as his ocean craft would take him, and in the following year was killed by cannibals on the island, now Hawaii, which he had discovered among a group, the Old Sandwich Islands. Jonathan Carver proposes transcontinental waterway. It is said that Jonathan Carver of Connecticut, a captain in the war waged with England by which France lost Canada, was the first to definitely propose the transcontinental journey by way of the Missouri and the Oregon Columbia rivers. 3 years after the peace of 1763, he left Boston to visit the sources of the Mississippi and the adjacent regions for purposes of trade, exploration, and investigation as to the country of the far west. He applied himself to the study of the Indian languages that he might pursue all these objects, and in this work he spent 2 years and 7 months. After his return to Boston in 1768, he published an account of his travels and experiences, and he tells us, "From the intelligence I gained from the Nandawasi Indians, whose language I perfectly obtained during a residence of 5 months, and also from the accounts I afterwards obtained from the Assiniboines, who speak the Chippewa language and inhabit the heads of the River Bourbon. I say from these nations, together with my own observations, I have learned that the foremost capital rivers on the continent of North America, the St. Lawrence, the River Bourbon, Mississippi, and the Oregon, or the River of the West, have their sources in the same neighborhood. The waters of the 3 former are within 30 miles of each other. The latter, however, is rather farther west. The want of means prevented Carver from prosecuting his design with the government, which was to prevail upon its authorities to establish a post near the Straits of Anian, after a journey had been effected to the Pacific coast. In 1774, he obtained the support and cooperation of Richard Whitworth, member of the British Parliament for the town of Stafford, of whom the projector of the enterprise says, "He, Mr. Whitworth, designed to have pursued nearly the same route that I did, and after having built a fort at Lake Pepin to have proceeded up a branch of the river Messery till, having discovered the source of the Oregon or River of the West on the other side of the lands that divide the waters which run into the Gulf of Mexico from those that fall into the Pacific Ocean, he would have sailed down that river to the place where it is said to empty itself, near the Straits of Anian." That the completion of this scheme, concludes Carver, which I have had the honor of first planning and attempting, will some time or other be effected, I have no doubt. Those who are so fortunate in it will reap, exclusive of the national advantages that must ensue, emoluments beyond their most sanguine expectations. And while their spirits are elated by their success, perhaps they may bestow some commendations and blessings on the person that first pointed out to them the way. These, though but a shadowy recompense for all my toil, I shall receive with pleasure, so that although Jonathan Carver was wild in his geographical assertion that the sources of the great Canadian and American river systems were only 30 miles apart, he was among the first, if not the first, to urge the sending of an expedition from the Mississippi Valley to the Pacific coast by way of the Missouri and Oregon Columbia rivers. But the prosecution of such a design by the government was to be deferred until the country had secured independent right to the territory from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi Valley, as well as that vast western domain through which poured the grand waterways to the Pacific, Jefferson checkmating England in the WEST. In 1783, the year of the Treaty of Peace with England, John Ledyard, a Connecticut adventurer, an educated man, and a British corporal of Marines under Captain Cook, also a deserter from the British Army before the war closed, published an account of the romantic voyages of that world navigator. The mercurial author also incorporated not a little practical information, quoting Captain Cook's glowing account of the quantity of sea otter and the superior quality of their fur in the regions of the northwestern Pacific. And although England had lost the war, her agents were already preparing to explore the country between the Mississippi Valley and the Pacific coast. Thomas Jefferson was then governor of Virginia, as he had been during the Revolution, and in the year of the peace he suggested to General George Rogers. Clark, the elder brother of Captain William Clark, a way to checkmate this obvious intention of English policy. Jefferson's words to Clark were, "I find they have subscribed a very large sum of money in England for exploring the country from the Mississippi to California. They pretend it is only to promote knowledge. I am afraid they have thoughts of colonizing into that quarter. Some of us have been talking here in a feeble way of making an attempt to search that country, but I doubt whether we have enough of that kind of spirit to raise the money. How would you like to lead such a party? Though I am afraid our prospect is not worth asking the question." Albeit a mastermind was pondering the scheme of a Mississippi Pacific expedition, the time was not yet ripe to bring it to fruition. In the year following his proposition to General not Captain Clark, while serving as minister to France, Jefferson met Ledyard in Paris. The restless adventurer was then out of employment, and Jefferson, through the influence of the Empress Catherine's representatives in Europe, enabled Ledyard to travel through Russia to within 200 miles of Kamchatka, where he was turned back and dismissed. Their design was to reach the Pacific coast of America by way of the Russian dominions and pass up the Oregon, Missouri to the Mississippi Valley. The proposed agent of that journey died in Africa in the following year. Discovery and exploration of Columbia waters, Ledyard's account of the voyages of Captain Cook, with its suggestions to thrifty Yankee merchants, was enthusiastically discussed by Dr. Bulfinch, his son Charles, and Joseph Barrel, the last a businessman of considerable wealth. The result was that 2 vessels were equipped and an expedition fitted out to sail to the Pacific coast. They were called the Columbia and the Washington, commanded respectively by John Kendrick and Robert Gray. The ships sailed from Boston on September 30th, 1787, and in January 1788, while rounding Cape Horn, a storm separated them. In August, the Washington reached the northwest coast near the 46th degree of latitude, or about the latitude of the 3 forks of the upper Missouri River and the Oregon Columbia. At that point, Captain Gray believed that he saw the mouth of a river, but his vessel grounded, his party were attacked by the Indians, one of them killed and another wounded, so he had no opportunity to verify his conclusions. On the I-7th of September 1788, the Washington sailed into Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, the rendezvous agreed upon in the event of separation, and she was joined there a few days later by the Columbia. Both ships wintered in the Sound, and the Columbia continued there during the summer, gathering pelts. Captain Gray, on the Washington, sailed the waters near by making explorations. He returned to Nootka, and he and Captain Kendrick agreed that Kendrick should command the Washington, remaining on the coast to pursue his discoveries, while Captain Gray, on board the Columbia, should proceed to Canton, China, with a cargo of furs representing the entire catch of both ships. This plan was carried into effect. Gray reached Canton, disposed of his furs, purchased a shipload of tea, and returned to Boston in August. The World, 1790. He had carried the United States flag on its first voyage around while Captain Gray was on his voyage. Kendrick sailed to the Straits of Fuca, traversing their entire length to the Pacific at latitude 5 degrees. He discovered that the neighboring lands formed an island, which, however, took the name of the British commander, Vancouver, who did not make the discovery until the following year. Captain Kendrick was killed by an accident. While the Washington was exchanging a salute with a Spanish ship off the Sandwich Islands, the Columbia, under Gray, after discharging her cargo at Boston, was refitted by her owners and sent on a second voyage, leaving her home port in September 1790. She reached a point near the entrance to the Straits of Fuca on June 5, 1791. After remaining in these waters until the following spring, trading and exploring, Captain Gray sailed southward in search of the river which he believed he had seen debouching into the ocean at about the 46th degree of latitude. On this cruise he met the Vancouver expedition, and notwithstanding the discouraging views of the British commander as to the existence of any safe navigable opening, harbor, or place of security for shipping, from Cape Mendocinos to Fuca Strait, the American captain proceeded on his way southward. On May 1, 1792, according to the logbook of the ship, penned by Captain Gray himself, he saw an entrance which had a very good appearance of a harbor. Entering, he found a bay which he named Bullfinch's Harbor for Dr. Bullfinch, one of the ship's owners. It is now known as Gray's Harbor. The actual discovery of the mouth of the Columbia is thus recorded May 2 at 8 p.m. The entrance of Bullfinch's Harbor bore north, a distance 4 miles. Sent up the main top gallant yard and set all sail. At 4 M saw the entrance of our desired port, bearing east-southeast, distance 6 leagues. At 8 a.m., being a little windward to the entrance of the harbor, bore away and ran in east-northeast between the breakers, having from 5 to 7 fathoms of water. When we were over the bar, we found this to be a large river of fresh water, up which we steered. Many canoes came alongside. At 1 p.m. came 2, with the small bower in 10 fathoms black and white sand. The entrance between the bars bore west-southwest, distance 10 miles, the north side of the river, a half-mile distant from the ship, the south side of the same 2.5 miles distant, a village on the north side of the river, west by north, distant 3/4 of a mile. Vast numbers of natives came alongside, people employed in pumping the salt water out of water casks in order to fill with fresh, while the ship floats in. So ends Jefferson sends 2 more ineffective agents. The discovery of the mouth of the Columbia by Captain Gray laid a firm international basis for the American claim to the vast extent of country watered by it. For a dozen years afterward, until the United States acquired the vast extent of country known as Louisiana from France the government, and Jefferson in particular made no real headway in exploring the Missouri and the newly discovered Columbia. Captain John Armstrong, one of those who accepted the mission, got as far as St. Louis and turned back because of disquieting stories of hostile Indians told to him by French traders, and one of Jefferson's men, a famous French botanist, Michaud, who had traveled in many lands of the Old World in search of strange plants and trees, had commenced his scientific investigations in the New World. The Frenchman started from Philadelphia under the auspices of the American Philosophical Society and the support of Washington's cabinet, of which Jefferson was then Secretary of State, on the I-5th of July, 1794. But when he reached Kentucky, got entangled in the machinations of Citizen Genet against Spain and England in their dealings with the United States, and the two fell together. Michaud returned to France in 1796. The United States acquires Louisiana. In 1800, after having been shuffled back and forth between France and Spain for several years, Louisiana became French territory, and Napoleon's threatened occupation of New Orleans menaced the free navigation of the Mississippi, as had been the case when it was under Spanish ownership. In March 1803, President Jefferson sent James Monroe as a special envoy to France that the complications between the two countries might be disentangled without a resort to war. Monroe was even authorized to guarantee to France her holdings beyond the Mississippi if the United States could be assured an outlet to the Gulf of Mexico for the ever-increasing products of the Mississippi Valley. While Monroe was on his way to France, Napoleon's plans had all centered on his ambition to crush England in Europe. No outside campaigns were to be considered, and a vast expenditure of money was required to carry out his consuming desire. Robert R. Livingston was the American minister at the French court, and while he was in no sense superseded by Monroe, President Jefferson and his cabinet realized that the issues involved were so momentous that they justified the addition of Monroe's long experience in diplomatic matters to the abilities of Livingston. When Monroe arrived, Livingston had only asked of France a bit of marsh and sand off the extreme end of West Florida and the margin of delta land that lies east of the main channel of the Mississippi between Lake Pontchartrain and the river's mouth. These modest sites were to serve for the founding of a town or gateway through which might pass the American trade of the Mississippi Valley. Monroe arrived with the authorization to offer France and $2 million for New Orleans and the Floridas. After discussions and negotiations, in which the chief figures were Livingston, Monroe, and their friend Barbé Marbois, Minister of the Public Treasury, Talleyrand, the tool of Napoleon, threw a bomb into the proceedings by suddenly asking what the United States would pay for the entire province of Louisiana. To cut many corners of explanation which are hardly apropos to a clear-cut history of Montana, the brilliant dictator of France offered Louisiana, if taken quick to Livingston and Monroe, for $15 million. There were no cables by which they could consult their government, and like brave men, they assumed the heavy responsibility of signing the Treaty of Cession on behalf of the United States on the April 30th, 1803. This all-important treaty was between the United States of America and the French Republic, or more personally, as stated in the preamble, between the President of the United States of America and the First Consul of the French Republic, in the name of the French people. It also specified that the treaty was made by the President of the United States by and with the advice and consent of the Senate of the United States. Consequently, Messrs. Livingston and Monroe were assuming considerable responsibility. The treaty traced the title of the very indefinite province through the agreements between France and Spain, and stated that the inhabitants of the ceded territory shall be incorporated in the Union of the United States and be admitted as soon as possible according to the principles of the federal Constitution, etc. Provision was made by the government of France to send a commissary to Louisiana to take over that country from Spain and transmit it to the agent of the United States. Special mention was made of the military posts of New Orleans, all troops, either of France or Spain, to embark from occupied territory within 3 months from the ratification of the treaty. The rights of Indians secured by previous treaties were secured. Equal duties were accorded Spanish, French, and American ships passing through the port of New Orleans for a period of 12 years from the exchange of ratification of the treaty. It is, however, well understood, continues the article dealing with this subject, that the object of the above article is to favor the manufacture, commerce, freight, and navigation of France and Spain so far as relates to the importations that the French and Spanish shall make into the said ports of the United States, without in any sort affecting the regulations that the United States may make concerning the exportation of the produce and merchandise of the United States, or any right that may have to make such regulations. Article 8 reads, "In future and forever, after the expiration of the 12 years, the ships of France shall be treated upon the footing of the most favored nations in the ports above mentioned." When news of the daring transactions reached Washington in June 1803, there was a storm of dissenting opinions, mostly caused by political heats. The Republicans, Democrats applauded it, and the Federalist Republicans vigorously opposed it, but it was ratified by Congress in October. In November and December 1803, the transfer from Spain to France and from France to the United States was formally made at New Orleans, and in the early part of March 1804, similar ceremonies occurred in St. Louis. The American Transfer Commissioner at St. Louis was Captain Amos Stoddard, an officer of the United States Army there stationed and accompanied, the greater part of the winter, by Captain Meriwether Lewis, who was then about to start on the history-making expedition to the Pacific coast, via the Missouri and Columbia rivers. The entire province had been transferred by the Spanish commissioners to Pierre Clement Lausat, the French representative, and by him to the American commissioners William C. Claiborne, who had been appointed governor of the new province, and General James Wilkinson, military commander. The French flag was then hauled down, and Lausat proceeded to perform the same offices at St. Louis. He ordered de Lassus, lieutenant governor of Upper Louisiana with headquarters in that place, to turn his district over to Captain Stoddard. On March 9, 1804, the American troops under command of Captain Stoddard's adjutant, Lieutenant Stephen Worrell, crossed the river and escorted Captain Stoddard and Lewis and other prominent Americans to the government house. From that mansion, de Lassus read a proclamation releasing all French inhabitants in the district from allegiance to their mother country. After this, the transfer was formally signed by Lassus for France and Stoddard for the United States, and among the witnesses who affixed their signatures thereto was Captain Meriwether Lewis. As had been done in New Orleans, the tricolor of France was then lowered, The stars and stripes were raised, and artillery salutes and martial music proclaimed that all of Louisiana was territory of the United States.